everybody. We are live with Xpatweb and Tax Consulting South Africa. And this morning, we're going to be talking about the critical skills list and the tax update. Really delighted to be supported and sponsored by Xpatweb and Tax Consulting South Africa today. We have Marisa Jacobs, MD of Xpatweb, joining us, and also Jean du Toit, who is Head of Tax for Tax Consulting South Africa. I'm going to hand over to our panelists shortly, but just firstly, a few reminders. We are recording this session, which we'll distribute afterwards. We do encourage you to use the Q&A functionality so we can be interactive. We are going to be running some polls throughout the session, so please participate fully. My colleague Cecilia, Vice President of the Chamber, will be answering your questions and feeding them into our panel throughout the session. And my colleague Ema is in mission control, driving the technology and driving our polls. I think before we start this morning and jump into the topics of critical skills and indeed tax, something close to my heart as a Brit that came over here on a critical skills visa nearly 8 years ago, but also tax is close to all of our hearts. I'm not saying that we all like paying it, but I think we're going to learn how to be tax efficient and how we comply with the law. But late last night, I got a text message, which I've been waiting for quite some time, confirming that the British Lions would be coming to South Africa this summer. For those of you who don't know what the British Lions are, I'm very offended if you don't. It's a collaboration of the 4 home union countries who come together every 4 years to tour, and it's a once in a 12-year opportunity to really boost tourism in South Africa. So just in the comments this morning, I want to know how people are feeling. Do you feel that in this kind of post-COVID, current COVID context, you would go and be comfortable in a stadium? And do, like me, you strongly believe that the British Lions will defeat the Springboks thoroughly this winter? So maybe just put your comments in the Q&A there. And as we're doing that, I'm going to introduce Marisa, Managing Director of Xpatweb, who's going to talk us through the critical skills survey that you've been running. Marisa, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm handing over to you.
Morning, Leon. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And Leon, Cecilia, thank you so much for the opportunity. It is, I had so much fun putting the slides together and sharing a bit of the survey results. It's always interesting to share it, but this year particularly because the Department of Home Affairs has released a draft list for the first time in 6 years in terms of what the new critical skills will look like. They've opened it for public commentary, and it is really it's an interesting list, and it's sparked much debate in the industry around commentary. I think just based on a lot of professional bodies and corporates are interested in commenting on it. We've received lots of draft commentary asking us to review it, plug in some of our survey results into their commentary to bolster the feedback. So it's definitely going to be an interesting list when it is published. And yeah, so we're looking forward to it. I saw lots of the attendees today are actually companies who participated in the survey. So thank you all of you for participating. It's really only through the participation that we're able to put together such a fantastic survey, and that the various government departments are taking it seriously because they can see the caliber of companies and organizations that are participating year on year and the growth in terms of the survey. So thank you to everyone, and it's a privilege to be sharing the information with you. So we had 209 participants this year, which is a record number. It's grown 10% again from last year. The survey's been running for the last 5 years, and it's over the years become, sorry, I just want to see, there we go. When we started the survey, really the purpose of it is and has remained to determine the extent of the critical skill shortages in South Africa and the role that foreign nationals play in addressing those shortages. The line in terms of how things have happened the last couple, in terms of last year, the Department of Higher Education and Training published their occupations in high demand list in August last year. We know the impact that list plays on the critical skills list. The Department of Home Affairs have made no secret of making use of that list as a base when they review the critical skills list in terms of seeing what needs to be added and what needs to be removed. So when they published it for public comment, we immediately jumped on it. We gave them the survey results of the previous 2 years and also all the data that we had collected to date before the comments closed. They were very impressed by the survey data. They'd used it before in their commentary. They asked us to please present to them the findings of the survey and to unpack for them a bit about the methodology that we use to make sure that the data is in fact sound and can be used when legislating the new list. We presented, they were very impressed by the data that we had put together, immediately agreed that they would want to incorporate it into the new list. They called for an interdepartmental meeting where they invited us to present the findings along with the Department of Home Affairs, Department of Labour and DTI. I remember very well when they called us for the meeting. You'll see here, this is the agenda of the meeting. It was a Friday afternoon at 1:30. And they'd invited all these departments, and I still remember discussing it with Muketsi and Dylan at the time to say, I wonder who from the various government departments is going to attend a meeting at 1:30 in the afternoon. But all the senior officials were on the call. We ran through all the data, and we were very pleased with how positive they reacted to the data and how willing they were to take the feedback on board. So that's a bit of feedback for the participants to say it's not all for naught. It was very, very well received. This is the final list that was published. You can see Xpatweb is quoted in the Gazette in terms of the data that we gave input in. This is some of the occupations that were specifically included on the draft list that were going to be excluded from the list. So this is the impact that the survey has already had on the list that we see today, and we are therefore very confident that with our submission we are going to be able to lobby for some of those positions that we've seen excluded from the list, and most notably that we've seen in the commentary as corporate general manager and foreign language speakers, and that there's been much debate about, a lot of media coverage on that, and our submission will certainly be centered around those occupations as well as a few others. So just a bit of context. So when the Department of Higher Education and Training drafted the technical report, which is now the draft critical skills list, it was not drafted by Home Affairs, it was drafted by Higher Education and Training, published by Home Affairs for public comment, and then the final list will be published by Home Affairs in terms of what will be legislated for the Immigration Act. So they looked at 3 criteria, and it had to meet all 3. It's not an all criteria, it's an and. So currently be an acute shortage, or likely to be in shortage in future due to the importance for South African strategic priorities. It must require a high skill level or advanced qualification, and it must require a long lead time to develop a domestic supply pipeline. So they overlap those 3 required boxes in order for that occupation to be on the list. So here we go. These are the results from the survey. So 77% of participants indicated that they struggled to recruit critically skilled individuals. 76% indicated that an international search would indeed help them to meet those skill requirements. And then very encouraging to see 81% of participants confirmed that succession planning and skills transfer is a priority for their business. This has become more and more prevalent in the last 2-3 years. And the Department of Labour, of course, published the Employment Services Act, the draft legislation a few years ago, where they are putting forward legislation that will monitor and control the skills transfer process for foreign nationals within organizations, to make sure that those skills transfer plans are not only being drafted but are being followed and progressed and updated as the expatriate assignment continues. When we met with the Department of Higher Education, Training and Home Affairs, they specifically asked us questions around the survey in terms of, in previous years, we would only ask, what occupation are you most struggling to recruit? And it would be a free text box where participants would type in, for example, engineers. But they would not go into the detail necessarily of saying, is it a chemical engineer? Is it an electrical engineer? What kind of engineers? And then once you've defined what kind of engineer you need, also what is it that you're specifically looking for when you draft that jobs ad? Are you asking for a certain level of education? Are you asking for a minimum experience requirement? It particularly came up when we were talking about the shortage of artisans, and how there are lots of newly graduated artisans who are struggling to enter the job market and high unemployment numbers, and where they wanted us to give a bit of feedback to say how many years of experience is it that employers are asking for. So a blanket view of it shows that 36% of the participants needed at least an undergraduate degree and 24% a postgraduate degree. So vast majority needing some kind of qualification level. I'll unpack it per occupation type later on in the presentation. So this is the top 10 occupations according to the Xpatweb Critical Skills Survey this year of most difficult to recruit, and this is in the order of most difficult. So engineers coming out top at number 1. That was very surprising. It's always been in the top 3, but we didn't quite expect with COVID and the impact that it's had that engineers would still rank so highly. ICT specialists, no surprise there. Foreign language speakers moved up. I think it was last year in a number 7 or 8 position. It's moved right up to top 3. Media and marketing specialist has been creeping up over the last few years. This year, right in the top there at number 4. Senior financial executives, we see that reflected on the draft list by a number of financial and accounting positions that have been added onto the draft list this year that were not on the list at all previously. C-suite executives, no surprise, and that of course is of great concern because of the corporate general manager being removed. Artisans is still up there. It's dropped a few spaces, and when I do the comparison year on year later, you'll see that that has gone down quite significantly. Healthcare specialists, of course, science professionals, and then accounting professionals. So just briefly, the difference between the senior financial execs and the accounting is, of course, that C-suite level versus the lower level accounting positions. Other positions that were quite high but didn't make the top 10 is STEM teachers. We've seen university lecturer being included on the draft list, aviation, food technologists, and general managers are some of the other top positions. Good. So if we look at a brief breakdown of the top ones. So engineers, the occupation breakdown is chemical engineers and mechanical engineers ranked very highly. Concerning is that chemical engineer and electrical engineers have been removed of the new draft list, but it's still ranking quite high on the survey, showing some concern. And then if we look at experience level needed, you can see the 3 to 5 years and the 5 years plus accounting for 46 and 37% respectively. So high level of experience required. The same with qualifications, undergraduate degree and honors degree in high demand. And then 97% of those who indicated engineering and shortage said that it is of vital importance for their business continuity and growth to be able to continue recruiting engineering professionals from abroad. ICT specialists, so these are some of the specific occupations that they've listed. IT application development ranked at number 1. Data scientists and data analysts, we've had lots of conversations since the launch of the critical skills list and the draft list being published. A lot of talk around data specialists being needed, and us having it's become a growing occupation, and the demand is far outweighing supply at the moment. You'll see a bit more of a spread in terms of experience level required, 3 to 5 and 5 years plus, and 1 to 3 years more prevalent here in the ICT sector. Qualification level still quite high. If we look at foreign language speakers, so the top languages that came up in the survey, French by far dominant, Dutch and Mandarin coming in second and third, and then also Italian and Spanish. That is very comparable to what we're seeing globally. Those are also the top 5 languages in demand globally, including the UK and Australia. Then if we look at experience level, so you'll see 40% in the 1 to 3 year bracket, so experience level lower here than in the ICT and engineering sectors compared, and then qualification level also more dominant on the senior national certificate and undergraduate degree side. And then interestingly enough, 100% of those employers who indicated foreign language as a shortage believe that it's a critical skill required for their business, and without being able to recruit it, they will suffer significant impact. C-suite executives, so this is split amongst COO, CFO, CTO, and CEO. The new list only makes provision for Chief Information Officer. They've completely removed any other C-suite positions on the list. Experience level spread across from 1 to 3 years. I did expect the 5-year plus experience level to be way more dominant than it has turned out in the survey. And then you'll see qualification requirements has been quite high, from masters to postgraduate to undergraduate, being the majority of the qualification level. And then 95% of employers consider C-suite level executives important to the operations of their business. Media and marketing, we've seen significant growth over the past couple of years. The occupations are broken down between sales and marketing, brand category managers, digital media specialists. If we look at the list, the previous years, there were no marketing related positions on the 2014 list. This new list has 11 marketing related positions. So the new draft list very much reflecting what we're seeing on the survey. And also requiring high levels of education and experience. Artisans, as I mentioned, very sensitive subject when having Department of Labour, DTI and Home Affairs on the same call. We spent a good probably 30 minutes of the discussion just around artisans and how to address that in terms of the balance between incorporating local labour force into the market while being able to attract skills from abroad to ensure projects can be delivered accurately and on time. Most significant, electricians, fitters and turners, millwright. The new list has excluded electricians and millwright from the list completely, concerning because we see on the survey those are in high demand. And you'll see here the data that they wanted. Experience level is of significant importance when it comes to artisans, and having been able to work, have worked on similar projects to what they are expecting to work on in South Africa. Again, we can see education and qualifications required for those positions. Good. And then just a bit of an overview, some broad data, some of the most onerous factors that guys mentioned when it comes to obtaining visas. South African embassies abroad, still lots of inconsistencies. And of course, with the impact of COVID on the different regions being in lockdown and only open a few days a week, there's been some significant impact. No provision made for it on the critical skills list. Professional body registration process, that has been quite a theme across the new survey data, as well as the comments that we've received. We specifically addressed it when we gave commentary to the Department of Higher Education and Training to say that even though legislation makes provision to attract these skills, some of the professional bodies are really an inhibitor to allow for the fast tracking of being able to attract those skills into the country. We will again be making representation in terms of that. And then the SACWA evaluation process, which we foresee to have even more challenges now that retrenchments and strikes are at play. Good. I've just put this slide again in there to see a review of the top 10 and then a bit of comparative data on the top 8. So you'll see engineers have grown from 16 to 18% in the last 2 years, artisans down from 12 to 7. ICT specialists are remaining pretty constant between 15, 17, 15 and 14%. C-suite executives down slightly from last year to match the 7% from 2018. foreign language speakers has jumped up significantly. We think that is also as a result of it being excluded from the current list. A lot more of the foreign language employers have jumped on to say, let's participate. We need that to be re-included on the list. Senior financial remaining steady at 7, media marketing jumping from 6 to 9, and healthcare professionals falling slightly from 7 to 5. Good, that is it from me for the slides, and then very happy to have some questions.
Thanks so much, Marisa. That's really interesting how prominent the language requirement has come in. That's quite startling. Actually, my son's texting me as I'm doing the webinar saying, where's German in there? Because he's actually studying German alongside his French at the moment, which would be interesting. I don't know if we can access that at some point. Perhaps before we jump into some questions from the audience, we can maybe run some panels. Ema, could we perhaps cue the first poll, I should say? So what issues do you foresee and this is to you, the audience, please reply. What issues do you foresee when it comes to obtaining critical skills visas after the release of the updated critical skills list? Renewal of visas for skills, professions no longer on the list, and I'm reading these out for the benefit of the recording. Not understanding the new skills, job titles, profession and categories. Third-party processes, SAQA professional bodies. I've had my fun with SAQA over the years. No provision made for skills, profession needed for the business. The process to follow if a visa is not approved, not applicable to me or my business. It would be really interesting just to see what's front of mind for you there. And perhaps we can look at those results, Ema, as soon as they've come in, and Marisa have the opportunity to respond. So the main issue that people are foreseeing is the renewal of visas for skills professions on the list. I know the corporate general manager is no longer there, which is something I came in on. So that's nearly 2/3 of us. Not understanding the new categories, that's a third. Yeah, the third-party bodies, 83% of us. The SAQA professional body registration. It's really fascinating. Even some postgraduate degrees in the UK sometimes not being recognised in South Africa for reasons that we can't really understand. And then half of us, no provisions made for skills, and then the process to follow. It's actually quite a lot. There's quite a lot of concerns for us there. I don't know if you've got any immediate responses to that, Marisa.
Yes,
I think the biggest one was the SAQA professional body accreditation. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the professional body accreditation is a massive concern point for the industry. We're seeing many of the professional bodies who have completely, since they've been legislated in 2014, they've really tried to make their processes streamlined. They understand the role that they play. They've engaged with the department in terms of enabling the critical skills list. And others have just not come on board at all. And I think it goes two ways. I think the Department of Home Affairs, when they legislate something like this that is involving a professional body, they need to interact with them more regularly and explain to them the role that they are playing and how if they don't play their part, then the list is for naught. The list is to enable employers to be able to fast track those skills that are most needed to be able to come into the country, transfer skills, make use of the knowledge that they have to grow the business and to inject into the economy. And we've seen how the use of foreign skills really create jobs for lots of locals. So we need that to happen. And where professional bodies aren't understanding that's becoming a problem for us.
So perhaps before we jump in, and I know Cecilia's got quite a few questions lined up, we can run our second poll, Ema. Perhaps we can talk to that, and that will inform some of our further questions. So what is the status of your matters pending with the Department of Home Affairs? Overdue but not urgent, overdue and urgent, not overdue, urgent submissions due. So please respond there. I mean, it's interesting, as I'm doing this webinar, I'm getting a a whole variety of WhatsApp saying, can I fly to Mauritius? My son's student visas run out? So these are people are struggling to gain access to the departments and the consulates around the world. But perhaps we can just have a quick look at the results there and respond to that regarding matters pending.
When we ran this, okay, here we go. Overdue but not.
So you can see, Marisa, overdue and urgent is 56%. So that's a big chunk of our audience. Perhaps you can talk to that.
Yeah, that's a massive chunk. When we ran this poll towards the end of lockdown, the beginning when things opened up again towards the end of last year, there were a very low number of cases that were overdue and urgent, because obviously Home Affairs had made use of that lockdown period to catch up with the backlog, get the visas out, and we were seeing lots of matters being resolved. And it's interesting to now see, we were definitely expecting, because the backlog had been caught up, that all new cases would run way smoother, because they were only dealing with new applications. But of course, as we've seen COVID cases within Home Affairs, they are only open a couple of days a week. They have skeleton staff in much of the time. So all the new applications are being severely impacted, and the normal 4 to 8 week processing time is not being applied across the board. So interesting to see how, 56% is definitely higher than what I was expecting. We're also seeing in the waiver section, specifically at the department, that they have put in some new processes. We know that the announcement by Minister Aaron Motsoaledi, where he has said that they're investigating a whole bunch of visas that have been issued to make sure that they were issued in terms of the Act. So there's this massive investigation. So there's lots of things happening within the department. And that is, of course, having some massive impact at the front line, as we can see with this poll.
Cool. Thanks, Marisa. Cecilia, what are our audience saying?
Yeah, we received quite a few questions, just the people submitted before even listening today. So I've tried to tick some off that Marisa's already addressed. And thanks for doing that, Marisa. I must say some of the results have surprised me. Dutch being the second most sought after foreign language, as opposed to German, like you say, that's kind of a surprise to me. So some interesting data coming from there. I wonder what the reason is behind it. But it's really good that I feel your critical skills list survey has been really thorough and really got the right type of information out. And a lot of our questions are around that, and particularly also how that's going to be used. Is it going to have a significant effect? There are two questions sort of around this. One from Alistair from Alpen Food down in Cape Town asks, how well are Home Affairs integrated into this new critical skills update? And in light of that, is it an enabler or a complicator of the current evaluation process? And then we've also got Nigel Diggerson from FCDO up here in Joburg asking, is there any evidence that the South African government is considering alternative means of matching South Africa's immigration policy to its economic needs, or is this critical skills list as good as it gets? So if you maybe want to address those two.
Yes, a very interesting question. So I think on the first one around Home Affairs and looking at the list, I know from discussions that we've had with them over the past 2 weeks, they are specifically engaging with a couple of employers around some of these skills that have been excluded from the list. So they're having ongoing meetings. A couple of guys have called us to say, let's just have a quick chat before we chat with Home Affairs next week, and to give that input. So it seems like they're really taking an active approach in terms of listening to the commentary that's coming from it. Remember, they weren't very involved in the draft list because it was based off of research by the Department of Higher Education and Training. So this is really the space where they need to now step in and say, okay, based on the research, based on the commentary, we now need to apply some other factors, not just research data, but comments and inputs and what are people really feeling on the ground. So I think there's massive interest. From immigration legislation process, we haven't seen much in terms of innovation when it comes from the Department of Home Affairs in terms of immigration. We're seeing a lot of countries like, Leon, you mentioned Mauritius earlier, they are doing much around investor programs and really attracting, giving property of residency by investment and incentives for guys to open businesses there. We're seeing really innovative things from Portugal and Mauritius. Both have done this new nomad working program where they're saying, now that you can work from anywhere, please come and work in our country, come and spend your money here, as long as you don't enter our job market and take jobs away from locals. So you have to be employed by a foreign employer and be earning a salary from there. Please come live here for 12 months and spend your money in our economy. Those are really innovative solutions in terms of using immigration to drive economic activity. The last example that I want to give is the UK, who've now done a specific visa for healthcare professionals, where they're saying, we have such a dire need, we aren't producing enough locally, we're going to need to look globally to attract them. Let's put a visa in place specifically for healthcare professionals, where we fast track the process and make it easy for guys to come and work in the UK. And those are all great ways that we could use immigration to attract investment and attract skills. And I'm really hoping that the critical skills list is most certainly the fundamental part of it, and we have to make maximum use of it, but I'm hoping that we're going to see some other innovative programs coming out of it as well.
Yeah, okay, no, that's really good to hear. And there's some encouraging news, I think, from that, and also encouraging ideas from other Southern African countries as well, which and it sounds to me from what you're saying, like the Department of Home Affairs is very open to hearing what other people are doing. Another, I found this one really interesting, from Chloe Cochran, Turner and Townsend, who's based down in Cape Town as well. From their perspective, and this is a infrastructure and engineering company, to those who don't know, Chloe says the drain on local talent through immigration legislation and mandatory early retirement is very apparent in the infrastructure sector, negatively impacting on the decision-making, planning, implementation, and operation of major projects. I'm keen to understand how the employment of foreign workers with critical skills will impact on a company's BEE scorecard.
Yeah, we of course know that there's a requirement to attract local skills in order to get your BEE scorecard up as much as possible. I do think there's some room for innovation there in terms of how do we use the skills transfer planning and the succession planning to we can use that in a sense to impact the BEE scorecard and to get guys, to motivate them to say you need to do the succession planning, you have to do the skills transfer, and give them some hard targets in terms of that. So the two can work together.
That's a great idea, Marisa, because that actually does incentivize the investment, because you want your initial team to be people you know and trust, who know your company. But then to be incumbent, say within a 3 to 5 year period, to develop a certain number of people in short, undersupplied areas, previously disadvantaged backgrounds, I think is a much smarter way to do it. Anything else, Cecilia, before we move on to the tax section?
Yeah, there's an interesting one, which I think it might be worth it, just also getting sort of straight to the numbers and what the current situation is. This is from Janine Fredericks from the Department of Trade and Industry. Her thoughts are that the Department of Home Affairs needs to revise their corporate visa allocation. I'm not sure how well you versed on this, probably well versed. I'm actually finding myself quite at a loss. I don't know what the current status is on corporate visa allocation. Surely that's also linked to what level of skills and what types of jobs again. Janine says currently it allows multinationals to import almost half of its workforce, which could be sourced from unemployed South Africans. And this could be a crucial point to look at. What is your opinion on that, your thoughts around that?
So the corporate visa legislation at the moment requires that at least 60% of your staff complement need to be South Africans, and you can therefore import the other 40%. So a corporate visa is really used by employers where they need to bring in a large group of foreign nationals for a specific project. So we see this happening often in energy projects or construction projects where they need to bring in a big group of guys who have worked on a similar project before, to be able to deliver on those very tight timelines and the quality, and then they need to pair them with some South Africans to transfer those skills, or they bring them in the development and the implementation phase, but then later on they need to start weeding them out and replacing them with South Africans. So I think the 60-40, it's very high in some instances, but in other instances, the employers struggle to meet those requirements. So it's very much, I think Janine has a great point, but it can't be. I think it's tough to have a blanket approach. There needs to be some categorization to say for certain industries this will work and for others it won't, or have a bit of a timeline period to it to say you can only have the 60-40 in year 1 and year 2 of your operations, and in year 3 and 4 we want to see that there is some steady moves downwards. And we also see the corporate visa often used in the agricultural sector, and the numbers are way more complex.
Thanks, Marisa. Thank you very much for that. I think I'm going to take 2 questions from Benjamin van As from Cogniplex here in Joburg. Pose 2 questions. The one is the draft skills list published by the Department of Home Affairs on 18 Feb 2021, and this is a draft list identified, for example, caravan park and camping ground manager as a scarce skill. Even though this is a draft list, how scientific is the compilation of the Department of Home Affairs scarce skills list? That was the one. And then he also wants to know, does the scarce skills list consider structural impediments which might artificially create scarcity? Bit of a hospital pass, sorry, Marisa.
Thank you, Benjamin. I was equally surprised by the caravan park and camping ground manager. I remember on the previous list, we also had winemaker on there, and there's always a couple of strange ones. In terms of the critical skills survey, we are most certainly not seeing those positions come up in terms of the tourism industry. So I can only comment as far as the list goes, and I also have question marks around some of those occupations. They've in the detailed list, they explain their methodology in terms of how they've got these 4 dimensions that they run through, and that is how they've come up with the occupations. But they certainly, I don't think when Home Affairs goes through the list and they put together the final list, I think we're definitely going to see occupations such as that being removed from the critical skills list, the final list. I don't think we'll see them on there. And then artificially creating scarcity, there is definitely those occupations where there is concern around that, and that is why I think that when the final list is being drafted, we will see those items being removed. But I agree with you, there's definitely some occupations being artificially created and others that should be on there that aren't being seen, like the foreign language speakers and the corporate general managers. The methodology that they're using is not pulling those through as it should.
I have no bias as a foreign language speaker and a corporate general manager, so we'll move on. It does pose some quite fundamentally philosophical questions about the nature of our economy and our worldview. And as we enter the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's going to be really interesting to see if the government persists on these protectionist policies versus movement of people across the continent. But shifting pace and moving on to something that affects us all is looking at the fiscal landscape. I'd like to introduce Jean du Toit from Tax Consulting South Africa. Thanks for joining us, Jean. And you're going to talk to us this morning about your takeaways from the State of the Nation address and the recent budget speech and other stories you're hearing coming out of SARS. Thanks, Jean.
Hi, Leon. Thanks for the introduction. Let me just put up my slides quickly. Yeah, okay. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the second session, which is aimed at giving an overview of the tax and budget updates following the budget speech last month in Feb. I would ideally need an hour to 2 hours of your time to deal with all the changes, because there is quite a lot to unpack. And I would have liked to delve a little deeper into some of the new law and policy changes, but our time is limited, so we will have to skim over some of the items. But we will share the slides with everyone afterwards. And if you have any other questions, we can address them in the Q&A, or you can just send me a mail, and I promise that I will get back to you on that. So the budget speech is not really where one would see most of the profound tax law changes. These actually take effect when the tax bills from the previous years are promulgated, but we'll deal with these as well. And as a general comment on this year's budget speech as a whole, I would say that it wasn't focused on increased taxes, which may have come as a surprise for some. But instead, it is quite clear that the government will rely on certain technical changes and enhanced revenue collection to fill the state's coffers moving forward. And if we look at the first slide, the government drew a comparison between South Africa and the largest economies of the world, like the UK, Japan, and the US, and the Eurozone, and then also the BRICS nations and Nigeria, which is the other large economy in Africa. And if we look at 2020, South Africa had a comparatively bad year with a 7.2% contraction of its economy. But considering that we were in quite a bad spot before the COVID pandemic, it could have been far worse, in my opinion. The UK, which probably had one of the most difficult times during the pandemic, suffered a mammoth 10% contraction, and India with 8% in contraction were the only two nations with a worse performance than South Africa. Looking at Nigeria, our other African counterpart fared far better with a 3.2% contraction. And looking forward, the government projects growth in 2021 of 3.3% and only 2.2% in the year thereafter. So if you look at the other countries in 2022, South Africa will have the lowest growth rate in this year, which aligns with what the IMF has published on South Africa. And in essence, what this translates into is that South Africa's real GDP is not expected to return to pre-pandemic levels before the latter part of 2023 only. Moving on, just having a look at the labor market, this is where our country was hit very, very hard, where millions of people who were actually in the employment market lost their jobs. The statistics around unemployment is likely the most problematic, and some of the consequences of this will take a little bit of time to manifest. But if we look at that, in the third quarter of last year, the unemployment rates rose to above 30% in our country, and the number of unemployed increased from 4.3 to 6.5 million individuals. 12% of people received no pay in the third quarter, and 20% of those who did get paid were subject to salary reductions. And just on a side note, a gripe for many South Africans is the fact that, as far as we know, the public sector did not suffer any job cuts, and I think, to my knowledge, I did not see them take any pay cuts either. But I guess we'll get everyone's views on that when we look at the polls. Let me just check. Yeah, that's unemployment. And what you can clearly see there is the impact that this had on the collection of taxes. Personal income tax was down 8.6%, where corporate income tax was down more, almost 11% on collections, if you look at the projected. If you look at SDL, the massive drop in SDL is purely because there was that SDL holiday that endured from July to August last year. And if we look at the revenue and expenditure forecast over the next 4 years, it is clear that if we look at the budget balance, which is effectively just the revenue collected less the expenditure, it is clear that things will be going better. But if we look at 2021, 22, 23, it is still clear that we would still be in the red for years to come, even though there would be some growth. And from this slide, there are just two statistics that I want to highlight, which are quite scary. And that's the gross debt increased from 65.6% to 80.3% of GDP, which is a very bad number, no matter how you look at it. And to put this into perspective, if you look at the last bullet, which shows us that over the medium term, our debt service costs are expected to average almost 21% of gross tax revenue. In other words, for every rand of tax collected, we have to use 21 cents to service our debt. And this represents revenue that will not be used to upgrade infrastructure or to fund important initiatives such as, for example, education. So the question is, what actually changed in this year's budget speech? Some were expecting some shock introductions of a new tax, or at least tax rate increases aimed at the wealthy to address the budget shortfall and to fund our vaccine rollout. But the government already noted in the medium-term budget speech last year that we have effectively reached the Laffer curve, and any increased taxes will do far more harm than good. So what they did was, for this reason, the government adjusted personal income tax brackets and rebates with an above inflation rate of 5% instead of hiking taxes. And this effectively means that a reduction of 2.2 billion rand in revenue for the government. And this change may seem insignificant, but if the government decided to keep the brackets and the rebates stagnant, as it has done in the past, it would have resulted in additional revenue of 11.2 billion rand. And this brings us to the next slide, which also explains why the government had no choice but to keep tax rates stable for a change. And if we look at that table, it's clear that the burden on high income earners in South Africa is patently clear. More than half of registered taxpayers in South Africa do not pay taxes at all because they fall below the threshold. And if we look at the other end of the table, to taxpayers who earn more than 750,000 rand per annum, this only represents 3.7% of registered individual taxpayers in our country. But if you look at what they contribute, this amounts to almost 50% of collected revenue. And this just again shows why the government could not again look to higher earning taxpayers to make up the shortfall. And they couldn't impose any additional tax hikes either. So if we just quickly run through this, the medical tax credits were increased as well. Local prescribed subsistence allowances have remained unchanged. The same applies to foreign subsistence allowances. And our final point on the budget and the rates that actually changed, the UIF contribution ceiling was increased to just over 17,000 Rand. And this was announced to take effect on 1 March 2021. But this was a mistake, which is important to note. The increase will only be confirmed by government notice, and this date is not yet known. So the next item we'll look at is future potential tax changes. But I think, Leon, I think at this point we can do our first poll.
Thanks, John. Yeah, some pretty worrying statistics that we're seeing there. I'm waiting for the second half to show us the good news. But what are your views? This is the audience on the 2021 tax changes announced. The tax breaks provide welcome relief, acknowledging the difficult positions faced by employees and those who provide for family and the communities. If government employees were forced into taking pay cuts and experienced the same degree of retrenchment at state level compared to private companies, the tax breaks could have been vastly better. Interestingly, I do believe the cabinet took a 30% cut, the president did, but not beyond in the broader public sector, which employs a significant amount of South Africans' workforce. The government should have increased the tax rates for wealthy individuals to reduce the net take-home pay gap, or your views aren't reflected on the above options. Some quite detailed responses there, but really welcome your observations and views here as the audience. And Ima, just throw those up as and when they're ready. And Jean, perhaps, do you feel there was a real fear of increased fiscal emigration, given the SARS looking at capturing foreign money earned overseas for South Africans? Do you think that's impacted their policy not to raise the tax burden on that demographic?
I think certainly if you look at the table that we put up there, SARS and the government is relying heavily on that segment of the tax base. So I think they were definitely scared if they were to impose further taxes on these individuals, they might alienate them and we might lose them to the tax base forever, which would be a disaster for the country.
So there we can see that over half of the audience are looking at the government employees. If they were being forced to take tax breaks, that would perhaps be fairer, more equitable. 27% the government should increase the tax rates for the wealthy individuals to reduce the net take-home pay gap. Interesting. And yeah, so that's the key criteria, really looking at the government and public sector and taxing the wealthier, which we're perhaps discussing, suggesting, are these people already severely burdened? Bearing in mind, many of these people that face that tax burden actually don't use anything the state provides. They pay for private security, private healthcare, private schools. So what are your observations there on what the audience is saying?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, for the most part where we've run this poll, everyone's view is that it is quite unfair to impose further taxes on struggling households, but the public sector seems to be completely untouched by the pandemic, not taking pay cuts, not taking job cuts at all. So I think it would have, maybe it's because it is an election year, but everyone was pushing for government to cut the public sector wage bill, but it seems because of unions and all the politics involved, they are quite hesitant to do that. But at some point, I do think that they would have no choice. Maybe in next year's budget, where it's not an election year, we might see a more equitable solution from government.
Okay, thanks, Sean. I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, so the budget document also has a chapter dealing with tax policies where the government gives us an indication at what may change in future budget cycles. And we'll very quickly run through a couple of these, although we don't really have time to discuss them in detail. Yeah, the first one is quite interesting, and given that employees are working remotely across the board, the government will assess the efficacy of travel allowances as a whole, although I don't think they would be able to phase that out completely. They want to revise long service awards as well. They want to curb the abuse of the employment tax incentive where employers try to claim it where they have students working at their company. Even more further retirement reform on the agenda. And I think this one is, this one is important. We can pause here for a moment. So currently, where a South African tax resident ceases residency, they have to pay what is colloquially referred to as an exit tax, which is effectively a capital gains tax on your assets. And this, in essence, creates the opportunity for SARS to tax the growth on your assets before you leave the South African tax net forever. And currently, as it stands, this tax is not applicable to your retirement benefits. So it falls outside your asset base for purposes of this tax. But it is proposed that your retirement fund interest now be included in your assets for purposes of the exit tax, which will make the decision to immigrate a far more complex one moving forward. But we'll look at that in conjunction with changes that have already been made. Government also wants to curb the abuse of the donations tax deduction. And they also want to change the advanced ruling system. And we really hope that this is not a signal of phasing out this thing completely, because we use it quite regularly with our clients to give them comfort. The same with the voluntary disclosure program. I don't think they'll remove it completely, but I do hope that they change it to make it more accessible for taxpayers who want to come clean. So as I mentioned earlier, the budget is in essence a bit of a non-event when it comes to tax amendments, but it doesn't mean that there are no changes that we need to take note of. The government promulgated the changes from the previous budget cycle in January this year, which means that most of these changes actually took effect in the beginning of this month. So it is important to have a look at these as well. And the first, this is not an entirely new amendment, but this South Africa introduced retirement reform. I think it started back in 2016, and the effective date for these reforms was postponed year on year, and it finally, the effective date was 1 March 2021. After numerous consultations, this finally is now part of our law, but I don't think we have time to run through these in much detail. So if you do have questions on how these work, you can just pop them in the Q&A, or you can just send me a mail. And if we get to the legislative changes that came into effect with the latest promulgation of the tax bills, our first one deals with the travel restrictions, or the travel requirements for the foreign employment exemption, which was relaxed as a result of employees not being able to travel to other countries. And I must say that this was fairly unexpected, because there is no contra protection for government where the individuals were precluded from coming into South Africa for the same reason. But I think the South African government took lead from other countries who made similar concessions in making this decision. And so this change is one of two which received quite a lot of criticism from the public. As everyone, or as you may know, when you leave South Africa under the old system, you were able to access your retirement funding immediately. But from 1 March, taxpayers are no longer able to do so. Before, if you completed the immigration process through the South African Reserve Bank, commonly referred to as financial immigration, you could gain access to your funds. But after 1 March 2021, taxpayers will only be able to access their retirement benefits if they can prove they have been non-resident for tax purposes for an uninterrupted period of 3 years. And practically, this means that where you immigrate, your retirement funds are locked up for a further 3 years, or until you can show that you have been resident of another country for that period. And this is problematic, especially for those who need to fund their own relocation, because often these individuals need their retirement funding to establish themselves in their new country of residence, which, as we know, is by no means a cheap exercise. And this law change affects pension preservation, provident preservation, and retirement annuity funds. And if we consider this change in light of the proposal we discussed earlier, where an exit tax will be levied on your retirement benefits when you cease residency, it really does seem that the South African government wants to punish those who is leaving South Africa permanently, because now when you leave, you will be taxed on your retirement funding as soon as you depart from the country, because that's the date when you cease residency, and you'll then be subject to the exit tax. But at that point, you won't be able to access your funds because of this law change, which has now already been enacted. So you pay the tax on funds that you will not have access to until at least 3 years later. So this makes your immigration an even more daunting prospect. Yeah, that's just a breakdown of the process as it was before and what's changed now. This is a different change which relates to the reimbursement of travel expenditure, which has now been expanded, provided that your company's policies are amended to make provision for this. The law has changed for employer-provided bursaries, which can no longer be used to structure your remuneration package. That's just the section dealing with this. And this brings us to our final change, which is probably the most controversial and which applies to everybody in South Africa. The Tax Administration Act makes provision for instances where you can be found guilty of a criminal offense. And these range from minor tax offenses, such as not updating your details, to outright tax evasion. Now, this change is focused on minor tax offenses. And previously, you were only subject to criminal sanction for these minor offenses where you willfully and without just cause committed certain transgressions. In other words, there had to be an element of intent for you to be open to criminal prosecution. So in other words, where you made a mistake out of ignorance of your obligations, these provisions would not come into play. But the law has now changed, and the wording has been amended to state that where you willfully or negligently commit these transgressions, then you will be held criminally liable. And we were in Parliament when this change was debated, and the reason for the change was because the National Prosecuting Authority is apparently having difficulty in proving the element of intent, which makes it too difficult for them to prosecute tax offenders. Whether that's fair is an entirely different question. This is the provision that we are currently considering, but that doesn't show the change. So if we look at the next slide up top there, you can see the element of negligence is now all that is required. And if you look at the offenses underlying this provision, it's clear that this can happen to almost anyone. Not updating your registered particulars is a criminal offense. Giving tax advice where you are not registered as a tax practitioner, or where you as an employer or withholding agent fail to withhold the tax and pay it over to SARS, you are guilty of a criminal offense. Equally, where you are one of those who never check their e-filing and SARS happen to ask you for supporting documentation after you've submitted your return and you fail to do so, you are guilty of a criminal offense and you can face jail time of up to 2 years. So it seems that the days where taxpayers can plead ignorance of their tax obligations might be a thing of the past. And this is just the other section which deals with more serious tax offenses. And I think before we move into our last segment, Leon, I think we can do the final poll for today.
Thanks, John. I think the good news there is that we're all only facing 2 years in prison. So before we before concluding, let's look at the poll for you, the audience. What are your views on removing intent from tax law for certain offences? Is this about time we put non-compliance behind bars? This is unfair and unconstitutional. Concern about my colleagues, in brackets yourself. My views are not reflected by the above options. Please expand in the chat. I think that's a really interesting poll. I welcome your results. And is there any case law, Jean, or have we seen so far in terms of people being prosecuted, facing jail time for, losing a few restaurant receipts and not submitting them? Or are we talking like up to 900 million that's been kind of moved offshore?
No, that's actually a very interesting question. We do see SARS more and more going after, minor transgressions, not in terms of this new law specifically, but as you mentioned, small business owners who didn't report their VAT correctly, things like that. We see this more often, but we haven't really seen them go after, the big fish, which is what we all want to see, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So can we look at the results of that poll? So there we go. Wow, 50-50. Unconstitutional and about time. I think with anything, we won't have time this morning, it's around the nuance of going after the perhaps organized, deliberate offenders versus those of us that can't afford tax attorneys or expensive accountants to look at our tax affairs. But let's move on. We're kind of heading into the last 5 minutes of the session now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, I think this sets the scene for our final topic, which is the SARS landscape. And the government, together with SARS, is creating a framework that will enhance enforcement and ultimately promote voluntary compliance, as we can see with this latest law change. And the aim of this is to ultimately have a strong deterrence factor. SARS wants taxpayers to fear the consequences where they are non-compliant. Because at the moment, many feel that they can take their chances. I think it's been noted quite widely that our tax morality is troublingly low and has been for several years. So there is a realization that change must come within SARS. We cannot keep legislating to collect more taxes. And the wheels are in motion. The president at different times in the past established several commissions that deal with the South African tax system. And the one is the Davis Tax Committee, and the other is the Nugent Commission, which was established to look into the administration of SARS after it was hollowed out during the previous administration. But both commissions concluded their work in 2018 and issued numerous reports, especially the Davis Tax Commission, on their findings, and honestly, we haven't heard much about these reports or the commissions since until now. In the budget, it was noted that SARS has already implemented 14 of the Nugent Commission's recommendations, which includes the re-establishment of the large business center and other units focusing on litigation, compliance, and integrity. Because these were disbanded under the commissioner, under Commissioner Tomoyane. And it really is a good thing to see that these are being re-established. Further recommendations will also be implemented to improve the governance and integrity of structures at SARS, for example, where we want to remove the commissioner or appoint a new one. And aside from the Nugent Commission's recommendations, the government also indicated that they'll adopt some of the Davis Tax Committee's approaches, which is to focus more on wealthy taxpayers. And the chair of the committee, Judge Dennis Davis, which is one of our most esteemed judges on fiscal issues, has been saying for years that wealthy taxpayers are not disclosing their wealth accurately. And he is advocating for lifestyle audits, and it seems that SARS will enhance enforcement among this segment of the tax base. Yeah, and we have to some degree seen this already, where taxpayers receive, for example, a notice like this one, which is quite scary if you look at it, because it states that SARS has received information from other countries on your offshore assets, and it wants you to explain why this was not disclosed to them. And to date, the mechanisms like the Panama Papers and the automatic exchange of information among countries remained largely underutilized by SARS. But this notice indicates that SARS is finally coming to the party. And all in all, the penny seems to have dropped, that the government, they can't change the law to make up the revenue shortfall. SARS must change and improve their collections. And with a limping economy, the government will rely more heavily on SARS to extract taxes more efficiently. So I think this is where we can expect to see the biggest change in the coming years. And with the new commissioner, we have seen certain things that it looks like SARS is making changes for the good. And SARS recently published its 5-year strategic plan, which is built towards a vision of re-establishing a revered revenue authority that is smarter and which operates with integrity, and one that will encourage voluntary compliance. So in essence, what it wants to do is get the institution to where it was back in its heyday, which, looking at the poll, is at least something that 50% of us hope to see sooner rather than later. But I think most wants to see an effective revenue authority. There were some interesting cases. You can go and have a look at that. I don't think we have time to run through these. Yes, and then just as a final note on our book, we were given the opportunity by LexisNexis to author a book on expatriate taxes. It was published back in 2018, and we had the privilege of doing our book launch with the British Chamber. We had 2 events in Johannesburg and Cape Town. Our book has had more success than we could have hoped for, and our highest praise came from the very Judge Davis, who chaired the Davis Tax Committee, who did us the honor of writing our foreword, which you can see there. And we are actually busy with our 2nd edition, which is set for publication in June this year. And hopefully, if COVID permits, we can do our launch with the British Chamber again. And yeah, that concludes our discussion.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much for that. And it actually does bring back the memories of when we did launch that book at the Inanda Club, I think in 2019, in the days when we could meet, have a glass of wine and actually interact. But we look forward to doing that again. And that was a good event. And we've had a series of events with you all subsequently. I think before we generally conclude, I think perhaps Cecilia has a question of her own or from the audience that we can address specifically on the tax. Yeah.
I think to get to the tax, there's actually been a bit of a silence, pretty much probably like the Lions will have after losing to the Springboks later this year. But
we'll come back to that.
I do have to say, Jean, there's it's a meaty presentation, and I'm almost sorry you skipped through some of those cases right up until the end. I did quickly glimpse my maiden surname van der Merwe versus SARS and got a bit of a, ghost walking over my grave. But no, in all seriousness, though, you're an admitted attorney and you specialize in dispute resolution. So I'm actually, from my side, I'm wondering, what cases do you most often deal with? And is there specific types of cases and disputes that you've seen a sharp increase in over the past year or 2?
Yes, certainly. I think what we have seen in practice is cases that deal with tax administration, particularly on the collection of taxes from SARS and where they do not follow the correct procedure. For example, SARS can, in terms of the Tax Administration Act, appoint a third party to collect taxes on their behalf. And normally what they do is they appoint your bank, and they then send a letter to your bank to empty your bank account and pay it over to SARS in satisfaction of an alleged tax debt. And we have assisted several taxpayers in going to the High Court on an urgent basis to go up against SARS where they didn't follow the correct procedure in doing so. And I think because of the budget shortfall, SARS may, out of desperation, acted in certain instances without observing the proper procedure.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's quite scary.
Thanks. We can pick up Cecilia's case offline afterwards, so Jean, I think she's worried about that. But well, thank you both. And before I conclude, perhaps I'll come back to Marisa quickly and just see, do you have any concluding comments around your presentation, the questions, the polls, or indeed what Jean said this morning?
Thanks, Leon. I think the questions have been so interesting, just around the critical skills data that's been collected, the amount of participation from employers that we've seen, both in the media and just guys sending through questions and comments has really been encouraging. It's the purpose of publishing a draft list is to get the inputs from everyone. If they didn't want the inputs, they would have just drafted the final list and said, good luck, guys, deal with it. But they haven't done that. They've specifically encouraged commentary. So please don't think that your commentary will fall on deaf ears. Please send it to us. If you don't want to do your own submission, we are including loads of submissions in our submission to Home Affairs. So if you've just got a comment or two that you don't think warrants a full submission on your own, please send it to us. We'll absolutely incorporate it, and let's make this the best list possible to assist employers to be able to attract skills to South Africa and grow the economy.
Thanks, Marisa. Thank you very much. Jean, any final words from yourself?
No, not really. I think it's just important from my side for all taxpayers to ensure that they understand their tax obligations, because it seems that SARS will be holding every one of us to a higher standard. And if they enforce this legislation, you can be sitting in a nasty position where you have a criminal record for being negligent in essence.
Yeah. Thanks, Jean. And Cecilia, from your side, any final comments?
I think just really thank you to both of you for what is really quite critical information, I think, and something that, as you say, sort of negligence, even just failure to take note of some of these things is something that we have to be aware of, can have very serious consequences. And I'd recommend any one of our attendees to also keep an eye open for that second edition of your book, which will also help and spread the word. Because the first one was really worthwhile, was really a good book. So encourage everyone to have a look at that.
Thanks, Cecilia. No, thank you to Marisa at Xpatweb, Jean at Tax Consulting SA, to my colleague Cecilia for feeding in the questions, and Ema Mission Control for feeding the polls in, and Leslie and Venice in getting us all in the right place at the right time. And thank you to you, our members, for staying with us. We are being a bit tongue-in-cheek about the British Lions, but it's a real coup for South Africa that the tour is still going ahead, and hopefully a welcome injection to our economy. And given the data you shared, John, we really need it. And for me, I've got a board meeting tomorrow, and I've been really looking ahead for what do the next 12 months mean for us. And I think with the British Lions tour coming up, with the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Kigali, we've just absorbed the chamber in Zimbabwe, Harare, with potentially 40 new member companies, and we're expanding into the SADC region and really working much more closely with the DIT and the Foreign Office around a joint program of events and communications to ensure that we can leverage from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We can indeed navigate the post-Brexit environment and build back better coming out of this COVID context. Next week, we have a webinar with Henley, which we will invite you to, where we're going to be looking at some of the leading health tech initiatives that COVID has accelerated. So really, just to say, again, thank our panelists and sponsors. Thank you, our members. Really looking forward to seeing you on the next webinar and to meeting you in person at some lively events coming up in the near future. And perhaps you can share some of your South African exuberance and confidence about how you will defeat the British, and we can feed that into our economic recovery. Thank you all. Have a great day. We'll speak to you very soon. Thank you.